from our perspective, it's so difficult to take anything but a modern perspective and just roll your eyes backwards out of your head so that you see your brain. It's so stupid. But the idea is that the purity and the righteousness of children would prevail. And I can't believe that anybody in their right mind thought that militarily that was the thing to do. And so look that up. We should learn some more about that. I don't really quite know where the impetus for the Children's Crusade politically came from. Jonathan Henry.
Well, I think you kind of said it, but religiously, children are seen as incredibly pure.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably
Yeah.
the main thing. If we're not going to be ethnocentric about it,
Right.
view it from their
Yeah.
context. That would most likely be the reason.
They make great slaves. That's exactly what happened. Or they just died. Right.
I was going to add that Black Expectancy was really, really short back then. So
Right.
people are supposed to go with it.
That's a really clever point, and an extremely strong point to remember is that life expectancy was so short. There was no real such thing as childhood, or even being a teenager. You know, your teenage years is a time of leisure to kind of explore yourself. No, you're working, or you're dead.
And also, I think you feel sorry, you wouldn't kill a kid, you put him into slavery, but you wouldn't martyr the kid
Yeah,
just because he has a pitchfork.
yeah,
So I think that may have been another reason why they sent him off to war, knowing that the
Yeah.
other army isn't going to fight kids because
Yeah.
it pull on the heartstrings.
yeah, except it didn't. So, I was talking with my carpool friends today, it's, if ever you're tempted to think that the world is going to hell in a handbasket and it's the worst it's ever been right now, I think the fact of the matter is we just have communication, so we have a wider knowledge of what's going on right now. You cannot tell me what was happening in 1300 wasn't just as bad and just as tragic, and if you knew what was happening there, you'd be crying your eyes out every day, just like we are. It's just, for good or for ill, we're informed. So, with that cheers me up. There's this famous quote made about the 14th century, which is the same thing as the 1300s. And it's like my favorite quote. It says, life in the 14th century was short, nasty, and brutish. What better attributes can you say? Short, nasty, and brutish. Story. I forget who said that. Somebody real famous that I should be able to remember right now, but the quote stuck with me even though the authority didn't.
There were two different philosophers at that time. One was really pessimistic and optimistic. And then they still said the same things, but from opposite points of view and back and forth for a long time.
Yeah.
I remember that.
Another thing that strikes me as extremely interesting is that if you look at real social progress and technological process in Europe, and I'm not going to pretend to know much about it in Europe, I don't know a whole lot about it, but it's interesting how stagnant and non-moving forward European society was for a really, really long time. Right now I can't remember what I was reading, but I read this last year and it really struck me as that is so true, is that pretty much until you get to, and actually I think they were talking about the United States as well, is that until you get to around 1870, you're living pretty much as you would have lived in the medieval period. Yep, and here as well as there. It's not until you begin to get to that number that anything changes in the way of how you live in a house or access water or use a toilet or reserve your food or go anywhere until after that.
That's the early days of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, well, the Industrial Revolution actually is alarmingly early. It's just that the effects of it don't begin to be felt for 75 years after early gets underway. They're doing cotton manufacturing and textiles in Rhode Island by the turn of the century when we're just barely no longer an English colony. And, that's pretty good. And, they've got steam factories and they got a railroad between Baltimore and Ellicott Mills in 1830. That's the first railroad in the United States. It just goes 30 miles, and that's 1830. But that's not trickling down to the wider demographic. There are parts of the United States that didn't have electricity as late as 1950, or a blacktop road, and that's 1950. So it takes a while before what technology is capable of doing makes it widely available to really change a lot. In the American Southwest, there's a lot of archaeological ruins of Native Americans that were indigenous to that area from time immemorial. And when you look at, you know, the buildings and the adobe and the bricks and the stuff they did, and you look at it, if you're looking at it with a European-centric view, you look at the ruins of Mesa Verde, or the cliff dwellings or something, which date from like 1300, well, really don't move. In Paris, they had Notre Dame, you know. Here's these mud hut walls, but in Paris, they had a grand cathedral all the way up to the top. But the larger reality is that, good for the cathedral, but the larger reality is that fundamentally in Paris, you had people living in mud hovels with mud floors, dead by the age of 20, just exactly like what you're looking at in the archaeological ruins of Mesa Verde or the cliff dwellings that you're looking at here. So by and large, the way it was for the average person there in 1400 was pretty much the same it was in others, in a society like either Native American or American Southwest. So I think that's kind of interesting as well, is that, you know, the good stuff and the good juju is always reserved for the smallest segment of society.
The natives were content. They were happy where they were, their drugs. They were much more comfortable than.
And they lived more sustainably on their land, which is not to say they didn't wear their land out. They make a mistake. The reason that they're not there anymore in that part of Colorado is they cut all the trees down because they had a drought. Except theirs lasted 100 years, and I bet this one does too. Because that's what climate cycles do. Never mind global warming, which is making it worse. And maybe making it so much worse we have no recovery. I'm very pessimistic about that. But they trashed their environment in response to how stressed they were. And then they had to leave. Our problem is we got nowhere left to go. We're between, as a friend of mine said, a rock and a hard stone. The expression is really between a rock and a hard place. Between two rocks. But it's a far more adapted. And another reason, it was far less concentrated. It was far more spread out. The population may have been quite large on this continent, but they were not all in tight units like they were in European cities. And cities are great. You're not going to hear me talk against a city, but a city will degrade an environment more quickly because you've got a critical mass. So I think that's just really interesting. Is the commonalities we could draw not only between where we are and where they were, but